What's going on, guys? National Master James Canty III here with Chess.com, and today we have Game of the Day with Magnus Carlsen Chess Tour, the finals. With the white pieces, we have Magnus Carlsen, and with the black pieces, we have Hikaru Nakamura. Let's get right into it, guys. It's a very sharp game, lots of tactics everywhere. So here we go. D4, knight f6, c4, and e6. Then we have knight f3, so no Nimzo Indian here. And then d5, just saying Queen's Gambit decline, simple, world championship stuff, played all the time. D5, right? Okay. Then we have knight to c3. After knight to c3, there's d takes c4, which is now saying, hey, we're not going to play the simple, boring chess here. We're going to play the Vienna variation, which is very sharp and counter-attacking chances for both sides. So if you guys want to look for something a little bit more dynamic or sharp against d4, and in the Queen's Gambit decline, you can actually do the Vienna variation, which is d takes c4. And let's see how Nakamura proceeds here. And actually, after d4, or after d takes c4, we have e4 from Magnus. And then b5, which is the mainline move here, just saying, if you capture my wing pawn, I'm going to capture your center pawn. Yeah, I'm giving you your pawn back, but I'm actually going to take the center one. So he says e5. Not only am I grabbing space, but I'm also attacking the knight. Knight moves, which is main line, and then knight takes b5, capturing the pawn on b5, getting my pawn back, having a little bit of compensation with the bishops being very open here, weak pawn on c4, double pawns, but objectively in equal position. After knight to b6, which is mainline stuff here, white actually plays bishop e3, bishop e2, or knight to c3 here, and Magnus shows something completely different, actually, and not played before. And this is not his first time playing these kind of things, just playing different from what everyone else would actually play. A3 here. He plays a3, which looks like it stops bishop to b4 check, and also just some other ideas that can come with a3 as well. But after a3, knight to c6 by Hikaru, bishop to e3, and then we have knight to a5. I like this move a lot from Hikaru. The reason being is because he's taking advantage immediately of the b3 square. If the pawn was on a2, the knight to a5 usually just wouldn't be a move. Like, why would we even put the knight here when the knight has no more squares to go to? But we actually have a beautiful square to go to here, so it makes sense to put the knight on the a5 square. And then queen to c2. Then we have a6, kicking the knight. The knight has to go. Anything that crosses the line needs to go. So I am in black's territory. I just need to go. So he kicked him. a6, white moves back to c3. Knight to c3, and black responds bishop to e7. Just developing. Easy stuff here. Rook to d1. We're going to develop as well. Put a rook on the d file here. And then bishop to b7 from Hikaru. Putting the bishop on the long diagonal here. Very good move here. Keeping the bishop open. Hence the move knight a5. Very nice. He already had this in mind. Putting the knight on a5. Putting pressure on the b file or b3. On the b3 square. And putting pressure on this diagonal as well. Also, you have to play on the queen side based off of the pawn structure here. And the pawn structure early on was telling us to play this way. And the pawn structure will always point to the side that you have the most play on. And for white, it would be this way. So, of course, it makes sense to see Magnus make these next few moves here. And you'll see after bishop e2, queen to d7, he's saying, hey, I don't know which way I'm going to castle yet. But he says, hey, you probably won't be castling kingside, will you? And if you do, I'm going to be ready for you, is what Magnus says. h4, followed by maybe rook h3, rook g3, h5, h6 is coming. This is definitely a strong kingside attack if we choose to castle this way. So black chooses bishop to c6 and says, I'm going to play on the side that I'm strongest on, which is the queen side here. So Hikaru plays bishop to c6, and Magnus responds, hey, rook h3, I'm strong on the king side. I'm going to play on my side, you play on your side. Whoever wins, whoever gets there first is going to win, right? Rook to h3. And then rook to b8. Playing on the side. Knight a4, bishop a4. Something's going to a4. After rook to g3, we were correct. Bishop a4 here. He chose the bishop instead. And after bishop a4, forcing a capture here because of the skewer here. Knight takes a4, queen takes a4. And now there's a thing, guys. There's a very important rule that I like to explain here. It's called to take is a mistake. So if I take this here, queen takes a4, knight takes a4, uncomfortable pressure on the b file. Yeah, you get the g7 pawn, but not much else after. And I would gladly give this pawn up for the b pawn here. a3's hanging, and also maybe a passed pawn. And my pieces are coordinated quite well, especially after knight takes a4 on the queen side. Coordinated. Very good. Now, to note, to take is a mistake, guys. We shouldn't take it. So we play rook to c1. You also want to keep the tension. So if you see exchanges, sometimes you just don't want to be the first one to exchange. You just want to keep a little bit of tension there. And let's see what happens. Rook to c1, defending the queen, also putting pressure on the c4 pawn. Knight to b3, saying, hey, you know what? I'm just going to plug the hole here. I'm going to put all my pieces here and defend this square. The rook on b8 is doing a great job of defending. Knight to d5. I mean, and maybe even sacrificing at one point here. Black has a lot of compensation here on the queen side and doing an excellent job showing it here. Now the rook is actually hanging. So what do you do with white? Like, we have to do something with this rook here. Do we go rook to b1 or rook to d1 or rook to d1, rook to b1? And Magnus says rook takes g7. We're not moving the rook. We're going to sacrifice some material for initiative here and see what happens, which it did happen. Knight takes c1. He takes the sacrifice here. Queen takes c1, and then we have c3. What a move, guys. What a move. Look at this move. Just take a second and look at this move c3 here. I have two ways I can capture. Both ways, black has something to do. If b takes c3, bishop takes a3, self-explanatory. We do grab this pawn, and we do have a passer ourselves, which is no, we don't have two rooks, so there's no rook holding the first rank here. So this is definitely a deadly weapon to use after the a3 pawn will fall. So he didn't want that. Magnus says queen takes c3, and after knight d5, we just go back. And the idea here was to just open the file. And on top of opening the file, the bishop pair is very annoying. And as we let time go on, as the game goes on, as more exchanges happen, as the space opens up and there's more space and things start to come off the board, the bishops will be monsters. So he understands this and plays knight to d5, sacrificing a pawn and actually saying, hey, I'm just going to play knight takes e3 here. And actually, yeah, he does knight takes e3. Yeah, knight takes e3 and pawn takes e3, because if queen takes e3, you hang on b2. Not a fan. And if the queen was placed better, if something was to do with the queen on e3, then maybe we'll choose that. But the queen doesn't even do much from e3 anyway. So f takes e3, not only making a hole for our king here, strengthening our center a little bit, and even threatening queen takes c7, which does happen after a few moves. King to f8, and then rook to g4, actually putting an x-ray on the queen, maybe threatening rook to f4 as well. And then after queen to b3, he says, I'm going to take the b2 pawn. And he says, I'm going to take the c7 pawn here. He's trying to trade queens as quickly as possible. Trading queens will almost end it here for white. So queen takes b2. And then king f2 here was played by Magnus. But there was a special sequence that could have happened here, guys. And this was talked about a little bit, is the d5 pawn. Moving this pawn, it could have got very scary. After d5, pawn takes, and then the e6 move with the intention of, if you take, we have checks. And nasty things happen here. Rook f4, king here, checks everywhere. Everything starts to hang. Stuff gets very bad for black here. And if we try a move like f5, well, you have a beautiful move here, guys. Something that you don't even think about. Rook to g7. Oh my goodness. Rook to g7 is on the board here, guys. It can be captured twice. If you take it with the queen, it's made on the back rank. If you take it with the king, it's made somewhere else, okay? Made everywhere. Like, this is a beautiful move. But he didn't go for this. I think he actually just wanted to defend his king first and play king to f2. Yeah, just get out of the way, and then we'll prepare this. But it's kind of too late. And Hikaru realizes that and says, no, not today. You're not gonna do it a second time. I will never allow you to do it a second time. And queen to b7 is now on the board. We can't trade queens, because if we do, we're just losing. So he plays queen to a5. And the rook's not even as active as it could be. It's literally like boxed in by the pawns. So we can't trade queens. We can't afford to trade queens, says Magnus. Now after queen to a5, rook to g8 here, we can't afford to even trade this, because then our pieces are extremely passive. And we're going to go on to lose this game. So he plays rook to f4, just putting some pressure on the file. Queen to c6, centralizing the queen just a little bit here. And defending e6 from any kind of attacks, actually. Defending a6 a little bit too, but really the main move is getting the rook out. That's what we want to do. Queen to c6, queen to d2 to follow. Very nice move, just defending. All we can do. All we can do here. h6, and then queen to d3. h6, and then queen to d3. We're attacking a6. We would love to take this pawn, because if we capture this, then maybe we have some chances of our own with the a pawn here. But at the right moment, we do want to capture on a6 if it's allowed. Rook to g7 here by Nakamura. And actually, queen h7 is also a move as well. So hence rook to g7. And he does actually take this pawn on a6. So going back here, though, queen h7 is a threat because of h6 and queen takes f7, but a6 is also hanging, so he chose rook to g7 to stop queen h7 from happening and being decisive almost. Queen takes a6, and now we're trading. Now, of course, yes, compensation-wise, we have a pass a pawn, which is actually, I mean, really not here, because, I mean, this can be captured right now, but it just wasn't yet. So after rook to b2, bishop e2, now Nakamura says, I'm going to get rid of it. I am not going to allow you to have this. And at this point, guys, what do you think about this position? Who's winning? Is it a draw? What's going on here? What's going on? For white here, white is definitely in some trouble just because of the fact that this rook is passive. It doesn't have much to do. It's kind of locked in here, like we talked about before, very short on spaces. The knight has no moves. I mean, look at this knight. It does nothing. You only can backpedal, which is going to take a long time. This bishop covers these squares, so if you ever jump in here, we just capture it. And the pawn structure is atrocious at that point with the pawn here, here, and here over. And then this bishop can't even move. This is extremely difficult for white to play. After bishop takes a3, g4, we have to push for something. Magnus will always fight to the finish. Bishop e7 and rook to e4, just a waiting move to see what black does. And then after rook to g8, we just go back. Again, a waiting move. What is he going to do? King to g7. And then we g5. We have to do something here. He's pushing forward. And h takes g5. And now here it's a big decision, guys. Do we take with the pawn or the knight? Taking with the pawn will be extremely passive at this point. The knight can't do much. So we actually took with the knight here. Going into a rook and bishop versus two rooks in game here, which there are some chances to hold. There are some chances to hold. But after this next move, guys, which if you can find it, pause the video and see if you can find it if you can. But if you can find it, very good for you. But here, after h takes g5, there's a move for black here that kind of just ends it all, guys. It just ends it all. Can you find it? Do you know what the move is, guys? Is it a pawn move? Is it a king move? What do we actually do here? Hikaru actually played rook to h8. Rook to h8, threatening rook h2 check and picking up the bishop here. Many ways you can go wrong here as white. So Magnus just said, I'm just going to step up here and try for some tricks. Last few tricks here. King f3, rook h3 check, and then king to g4. You take my bishop, I take your rook. But instead, he actually says, whoa, hey, that's one of your 4 pawns you had. Now I'm only down 1 pawn instead of 2. Here, right? 1, 2, 3, 4 versus 2. I'm up 2 pawns. He takes 1. Now he's only up 1. Bishop f3. Okay, after bishop f3 happens, rook to d2. Now we're attacking this pawn and stopping d5, but d5 is not really going to be pushed anyway because the e5 pawn's hanging. So we're fighting for our life here, as Magnus is doing. King h4, trying to figure out whatever we can do here and try to get any counterplay that we can at this point. The rooks are now doubled, the pawn's hanging, so he's like, well, I got to push it. I don't have anything else to do. d5. E takes d5 and rook f6 with the idea of maybe playing g6 in some cases. King h5. We're trying to do whatever we can and squeeze the position. Rook to e3. He says, no, you are not doing anything. Rook to f5. You're just moving back. Again, guys, the rook moved only from g4 to f4 to f5 in like 10 to 15 moves, it feels like. It's pretty tough to have this rook here. Rook to d4 check. King h5, and after king h5, a beautiful move here, guys. What would you do here with the black pieces? So much chess going on, so many surprises, so much sharpness here. What do you actually do now with the black pieces? How do you finish this? Can you finish this game? The move for black, he actually made rook to b4, as white is now in a zugzwang position here. He can't really move anything. Pawn can't really move. I mean, we're just going to capture it. Rook is trapped besides f6, and that's going to hang this pawn. The king can't do anything, and the bishop is very limited on space. And if you do move the bishop somewhere wrong, like bishop takes d5, is rook to h3 checkmate. Mate threats here, guys, because the king is in an awkward position, and we're cutting him off. So he chooses e6, going for the last thing he can do here. F takes and then rook f6 with the intention of checking, maybe trying to queen the pawn, trying to get the king involved, maybe the bishop. There's hope. There is hope here. And I tell my students all the time, don't play hope chess, but this is one of the times that you will play hope chess. Absolutely, hoping that we can win this game or at least get a draw. Rook to e5, and then rook to g6 check, king f7, rook f6, king e7, and hey, look at this. Okay, we're marching forward. But of course, Hikaru says, nah, you're not going to queen that pawn anytime soon. Not many threats here, and you do need to be careful yourself with the king's safety. Rook backs up to f4. Then we have rook to f8. And at this point, we are forced to trade the rooks here and go into a losing endgame. Rook takes f8. King takes f8. Bishop versus rook at this point. We have to do whatever we can. If we go king up, he takes on g5. So he plays g6 last try here. Hopefully, we can get king h7 in at the right moment. And of course, he stops it. King g8, blockading the pawn. And then after g7, the simple move, rook to e1. And at this point, Magnus resigned. He resigned right here. He said, I had enough. I can't do anything. There's nothing else to do. And Hikaru goes on to win the first match. of the Magnus Carlsen Chess Tour Finals. This was a wild game, very informational, guys. A lot of things you can learn tactics-wise, sharp play, opening play, stuff that's new in the Queen's Gambit Decline, and things that you can do with the black pieces and with the white pieces, and improvements that could have been made as well, guys. So I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I'm National Master James Canty III here with Chess.com. This was Game of the Day, and I'll see you guys on the next video.